Colleagues and comrades, good evening and welcome to this SCG event on reclaiming our education system. I'm Christine Blow and I'll be chairing this evening. And I'm delighted to be doing that because education is a big interest of mine. Let me say that more than 300 people have signed up to be at this event. So welcome to all of you. But let me say, please, send us solidarity messages as well as telling us where you're from in the Q&A. So let's get on to what we're going to be doing this evening. We've got 5 speakers. They're all absolutely fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. And after that, we'll take a few questions, as many as we manage to have time for. So first up is Daniel Kebede. He's our first speaker. He's the GS-elect of the NEU. He will take office in September, but he's already working really hard for the National Education Union. Members made exactly the right choice when we elected Daniel. It's a pleasure to introduce him this evening and to hear what he's got to say about education and the ongoing struggle. Daniel, the floor is yours. I'm delighted to introduce you.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's really great to be with you all this evening to discuss how we reclaim education in the interests of our children and our communities. Look, the Conservative legacy must not become a binding force on its successors. We simply cannot accept what the Conservative government has done as the ground rules for the next 10 years of education policy. Let's look where we are. We've got funding levels that are lower than 2010. We've got child poverty levels that are much higher. We've got an early years system, which is a patchwork of understaffed private provision and underfunded maintained nurseries whose very existence is in question. We've got a worsening crisis of teacher recruitment and retention, a punitive system of accountability, a narrow curriculum shaped by conservative dogmatists and culture warriors. Now, the recent document from Labour's National Policy Forum has begun to engage with some of these issues. It advocates, for example, the rolling out of an ambitious school improvement plan that would see investment in a high quality teaching and support staff workforce to deliver an excellent education for all. The recruitment of thousands of new teachers to fill vacancies and skills gaps, ensuring that teachers are no longer asked to deliver unmanageable workloads. The reform of inspection to ensure Ofsted provides true quality assurance for the government and the public and supports positive, proactive school improvement, and an end to the system of headline grades. Now, these are pointers in the right direction, but policymakers will really need to grasp the scale of the change that's needed. And I shall try and just unpick some of this. We've got the issue of funding, the key question that has united our profession, our families and communities during the current pay dispute and remains a central challenge. In 2022, the government spent just 4.2% of GDP on education compared with 5.6% in 2010, a proportion of GDP significantly lower than comparable high-income countries who spend on average 5% of GDP on education. This has created the reality that our class sizes are at record levels. Primary classes are the highest in Europe, and secondary class sizes are the biggest, the highest since records began more than 40 years ago. The scale at which refunding must work won't be covered by the commitments we've heard so far, by money saved by ending tax privileges of private schools, for example. We must go much further. The crisis is huge, and it is absolutely present in the crisis of recruitment and retention. Our education system is currently enduring. In our last survey of almost 18,000 National Education Union members, we asked teachers and support staff to reflect on their future plans and staffing situation at their workplace. We had 16% of teachers plan to leave the education profession within 2 years, and 41% of teachers responded saying that they plan to be gone within 5 years. And that was with us excluding the don't know answers. Almost a quarter of support staff respondents, 23%, will no longer be working in education by 2025, and almost half expect to be gone by 2028. Now, last year, ministers missed targets in both primary and secondary recruitment, falling 40% short in the latter. Now, according to the National Foundation for Educational Research, latest recruitment figures for April suggest the government is on course to fall more than 50% short of its secondary teacher trainee target for September. Continuing to miss targets by such a scale will simply lead to the entire system grinding to a halt within this decade. Now, the recruitment and retention crisis is also closely linked to the problems of workload and accountability. The National Foundation for Education Research has spelled this out. Workload is the most cited reason ex-teachers give for leaving teaching. Preparing to meet the demands of Ofsted and to achieve a good profile of results in high stakes testing make work intensity a real problem, because it's not just the hours that you put in, but the kind of work that you have to do and whether that work is satisfying or soul destroying. So teacher autonomy is vital for motivation and is linked to job satisfaction and retention. However, many teachers report a lack of influence over key areas of their work. In particular, teachers report a low level of influence over their professional development goals. Yet this is the area with the greatest potential to increase a teacher's job satisfaction. So schools need to not only be funded way beyond current levels, and if they're going to be adequately staffed by well-motivated people, the whole culture needs to change, not in just one or two details, but fundamentally. And that is the real challenge for the next government. Now, education workers are now among some of the best organised trade unionists in the country. In the NEU, we have really made things happen on the ground, not just by mobilising our members over pay, but by reaching out to parents and communities over the conditions of our schools. We made a difference in the 2017 election, and we can make a difference to the next one. But our members will be all the more willing to mobilise if they see a party which has a realistic sense of the scale of the change that they know is needed. And we really look forward to the big and unequivocal statements that make clear that Labour also has that sense. So thank you very much, Christine. Back to you.
Thanks, Daniel. That's really clear. Your commitment to education, in particular to attacking child poverty and making it a thing of the past, are really important, and clearly finger on the pulse about the important stuff about inspection and workload. So just G up to everybody there who's an NEU member to make sure that you return your ballot form, because if we're going to continue the campaign, we need a really good turnout in this the reballot for action. So thank you very much. And now we move to our second speaker, who is Janet Farrar. She's the UCU president this year, and she has a passion for further education. She teaches at Manchester College on the trade union education programme. UCU, of course, is the sister union to the NEU, and like the NEU is an active and fighting union. There's such a lot to fight about, I'm sorry to say. But anyway, we're really pleased you're here, Janet, to tell us about the ongoing struggles in UCU. Over to you, Janet.
Thank you very much, Christine. I'm going to try and not repeat a lot of the things that Daniel said, because there's just so much parallel between the struggles in the NEU and in our union. And just a little, if I can indulge in a tiny shout out to my own college, who are on strike today and have been for the last, what day is it? This is day 7 of 12. So yeah, please do send your solidarity greetings to Manchester College UCU. So really pleased to be here. Thank you very much for having me. This is a really important conversation, and everybody who is here has got a role to play in shaping this conversation and where Labour's education policy goes when we do have a Labour government, which we're all very excited about. So in terms of post-16 education, clearly our post-16 education system in England is in crisis, not just in England actually, but I'm going to focus on England. Because of over a decade of Tory austerity and the relentless marketisation in higher education and in further education, along with huge cuts in investment, have led to, HE students graduating with an average of £45,000 worth of debt. £45,000. That's the average. That is not a way for a person to start a career. And loans seems to be the way that it's going in further education as well. That's the only solution that this government has got, to go to loans in FE. And we've had huge cuts in further education. We've got a really severe staffing crisis, similar to what Daniel was laying out there. Even the Association of Colleges, who represent our employers, have recently put out an article saying how bad the staffing crisis is in FE. It would be quite nice if they'd take some responsibility in terms of fixing it, but I hold out hope. And there's a worrying imbalance across the whole of the kind of tertiary education sector. We've got these elite, in heavy inverted commas, higher education institutions, pre-92 universities, hoovering up students at the cost of colleges and of post-92 universities, or the old polytechnics, as some of you might know them. So that's the kind of context that we're working in. I'd like to talk a little bit about what UCU wants to see in terms of building a positive education system for the future. And the first thing that I want to focus on is staff, the most important asset that we've got in education. And we really want staff to be at the absolute heart of any policy. We know, and a lot of people on this call will know, that staff working conditions are the same conditions that our students are learning in. And it is vital that we stop treating staff like a disposable asset. And recognise them as the cornerstone of the sectors that we work in. We know that years of underinvestment in staff has seen pay in FE and in HE fall precipitously in real terms. We've lost around 35% of our pay in FE since 2009. And a lot of staff are stuck on this kind of merry-go-round of casual contracts. I made it sound a little bit nicer than it is. It's not a game. Some people are on perpetual casualised contracts and hugely overworked, chronically overworked. And of course, these factors combine to make staff feel undervalued, and resentful, and ultimately leave the sector in droves, and that is again exactly what Daniel was laying out. It's a bit of a bleak picture, although I'm sure there'll be a positive way forward that we can all work on together. So we launched UCU launched the Respect FE campaign last year, and a charter for professional respect in FE, which calls for action to improve pay and to reduce workload, because workload really is, the thing that our members want to talk to us about. Enhanced roles for trade unions and more collaborative approaches and inclusion of staff in strategic decision making. Newsflash, people who work in education know what they're talking about when it comes to education, and we need to listen to them. So in HE as well, in higher education as well, we do continue to push for improvements to pay and working conditions. We're in quite a bitter dispute at the minute. And, I do hope that you will join me in sending solidarity to all the staff in striking colleges, but also our members in universities who are currently engaged in a marking and assessment boycott. Obviously they're taking action because, we can't sustain a system where staff are an afterthought in policy making. So that's the first area. It's really important when we're looking for a positive education system for the future as well, that we recognise that diversity is a strength in lots of ways. You know, successive Tory governments have rightly recognised the importance of technical education, but in a really unhelpful kind of single-minded way, which has led to some very blinkered policy decisions, you know, frankly, a whole host of sound bites that just continue to irritate me. Plans to defund a range of applied general qualifications, you know, have rightly seen a major backlash. There was a recent Education Select Committee report which highlighted the plans to cut level 3 provision like BTECs, you know, and the damaging consequences that would have. And you probably or hopefully were aware of the Protect Student Choice campaign that UCU supported, you know, because they did some absolutely brilliant work in delaying these funding cuts, but ultimately we need a complete reversal of this damaging policy. And meanwhile, in higher education, UCU warnings about the impact of higher tuition fees and unrestricted student recruitment on the shape of the sector have come to pass, with a lot of newer institutions struggling to compete, basically, in the scrabble for students and for their fees. You know, we're back to this issue with marketisation and the fact that every student's got a value on their head, and that's the only thing that they're interested in. Post-92 institutions, so the old polytechnic universities have got a really vital role to play in widening access to education. But, you know, they're also increasingly exposed through real-term drops in tuition fee rates. You know, they're having to drop their fees to get the students in, and this kind of aggressive competition between universities that ultimately is going to be to everybody's detriment. So, you know, without action, both of these issues have potentially devastating consequences for widening participation in education, which, you know, we're a huge proponent for. You know, and we need to take on this pervasive narrative that has developed, which suggests that some courses are inherently more valuable than others. And, you know, there have been huge cuts to arts and humanities funding, and we've seen a lot of redundancies in our institutions. And, you know, it sends a hugely damaging message about the place of these subjects and, you know, the importance of these subjects that enrich all of our lives, you know, that culture enriches our lives. It just does. So reversing those should be a priority for this next government. And then, of course, I've kind of hinted at it, but ultimately we have to stop burdening students with loads of debt, you know, and we have to have this policy reversed. It needs to form part of a wider fundamental review of how the education system is financed. And the government's recent refusal to exempt colleges from VAT, because it would mean less money for the school's budget, you know, an attempt to pit us off against each other is never going to work, by the way, despite their stated commitment to technical education and its importance. It speaks volumes about this current government's unwillingness to put its money where its mouth is, you know, and the current system, it is broken. It is ultimately broken. It is built on an unsustainable mountain of student debt. We need a bold rethink to ensure that all parts of these sectors are secure for the future and ready to respond to emerging challenges that are facing our society, because that is the role that education has to play. So finally, you know, we need to encourage more collaboration in education. You know, there are really interesting lessons to be learned from reforms that have happened in Wales. Clearly, they're working in a very different political context to in England, you know, but they've really kind of sought to embed a more collaborative approach, which recognises that, you know, a buzzword that I'm not a massive fan of, but joined up thinking is key to making sure that all learners, all of their needs are met. So in short, you know, we need an education which is accessible, which is ambitious, which is adaptable and which values all of its stakeholders, including and most importantly its staff. Thank you.
Janet, thanks very much indeed. That was great. The Protect Student Choice campaign came to Parliament today, and lots of parliamentarians will have had photographs taken that I'm sure they'll be tweeting all over the place. This is a really critical campaign because defunding BTEC is a really terrible plan that this government has had. So let's just all say solidarity to all UCU members taking action everywhere. Send us some messages in the chat of solidarity so that Janet can take them back to her members. And don't forget that if you've got any questions for any of our speakers, to put them in the Q&A. Okay, so my technical wizard staff have sent me a list of everyone who's told us where they're from on this call. So West Wales, West London, Uxbridge and South Ruislip. I wonder whose constituency that is. Brent, Southampton, Chester, Hackney, Leeds, Essex, Hammersmith, Bristol, Sheffield, South London, Kent, Cardiff, and astonishingly, the Philippines and Portugal. Just goes to show what a wide range we have and how solidarity and the struggle for education is global and international, isn't it? Okay, so we now move on to our third speaker. Our third speaker is James Whiting. He is the General Secretary of the Socialist Educational Association, which is the Labour affiliate organisation about education, but it is open to people who are not members of Labour. It was formed in, it was given this title in 1959, having been originally founded in the 1920s as the National Association of Labour Teachers. James is going to join us this evening to talk about the SEA manifesto, which is absolutely what we believe the party should adopt in order to make sure that we've got a proper position on education at the next election. So James, over to you.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you for the Socialist Campaign Group for inviting me. Reclaim Education is such a great title, Reclaiming Education. It suggests that what we have to do is so radical and so far-reaching. It's like taking back the service, and Daniel's already outlined a lot of the issues. And so what I'm going to start with, what are we actually reclaiming it from? I'm a governor of a primary school at the moment. I have been teaching for a long time and now retired, but I interviewed a teacher that is leaving, unfortunately. One of the teachers that Daniel referred to, the numbers that are leaving are quite incredible. She is an excellent teacher and is really committed, or was really committed. It's what she says. I feel the education system is quite broken. It is very, very pressured on teachers at all levels. I don't feel there is space to just teach and enjoy the job. There is so much scrutiny, whatever level you work at. There is so much pressure to perform, whether it's SATs, whether it's Ofsted. In my role as a mainly Year 6 teacher, a lot of the pressure focuses on SATs. It tells the children that that's all that's important, and that's not the case. They need to have a well-rounded understanding of the world. I think it's quite disheartening, because if you struggle in school, it should not take from who you are as a person. But our education system is telling children that are struggling, that they are not a success, that they are failures. It really narrows their view. From age 10, kids are constantly tested. This will lead to a generational mental health crisis where young people feel they are failures. We want to teach them to be more rounded human beings. We want to be teaching them that who you are fundamentally matters. That is what we are reclaiming our education system from. And what we've done as an association is put together a manifesto, which is a broad vision. It covers everything. It covers everything from higher education down to early years to lifelong learning. And actually, when I was looking at it today before I came on this call, nearly all of it has been done in the past in some form or another. We used to have wonderful adult education. where you could turn up and learn how to do flower arranging or learn A-level French, whatever you wanted to do. We had a fantastic early years system. I think is probably the one that had the most and needs the most work on. But we had local schools for local children. We had a curriculum which was designed mainly by teachers. And these things are happening. These are the kind of things we're asking for. And if they're not from the past, they're from the future, they're from other jurisdictions where the different policies are in place which enable education to succeed for all children. And I think we can say that we need to be really radical. We need to say that this is what we are aiming for. It's not impossible, even though we're told quite often it is. And Labour has to tackle this, because young teachers like that are going to be leaving, not just for the pay, not just because of the workload, but because of the ideology that this Conservative government has put on the system. And that's why I really want to focus on, because there's so much other focus, but what is happening is an ideological coup. And this started in 2010, although there were signs of it happening before with the 88 Act and the Black Papers. But Gove's revolution has transformed the system in the way that the Tories wanted. So we have no choice but to transform it back, or to take it further forward, not just backwards. But we've got a system where teachers used to be pragmatists. They used to choose methods which suits their pupils. They used to choose elements of the curriculum which they felt suited, or devise things for their own children. And now we've only got one regime of truth, one fact-based curriculum, one means of assessment, test, one means of organising schools through multi-academy trusts. And increasingly, believe it or not, only one way of actually teaching. It's really hard to believe that right-wing teaching methodology is being imposed by politicians. Nick Gibb is an accountant, and this is what he says. The PISA results from last year serve to confirm the ever-growing body of international evidence on this point. The teacher-led instruction is more effective than child-centered inquiry-based approaches. He is an accountant, he's a politician. How dare he? How dare he tell teachers what is the best and most effective way of teaching for their children? How dare he? And yet this is what's happening. This is what's being implemented through the system. He goes on to say that it's his duty as a minister to push this approach. We all know that there's evidence for all kinds of different approaches to teaching, and that what professionalism means for teachers is being able to observe that and look at that and work with other teachers and decide themselves what is most effective for their children, not be told by a Conservative politician. So what we're witnessing is deprofessionalisation, and that is why the graduates like I spoke to earlier, who was a psychology graduate, actually, the teacher that I'm talking to, is leaving education because they're not being treated as professionals. The Russell Group, when they saw what was happening to teacher education, the Russell Group of universities said that it's going to transform teachers into executive technicians, people who deliver but don't critically think. And the latest edition of Forum, the left academic journal, has made a distinction between compliance, which is what the Conservative government want from teachers, and critical scrutiny, which is what any graduate, any professional in any role brings to their job. Looking at things, deciding for themselves, and deciding what is best for their children and their learners. So our manifesto contains a series of proposed actions on the curriculum, on assessment, on school structures, on funding mechanisms, on teacher education, because that is massive at the moment, what they've doing to teacher education. And it's only going to put off even more recruits from joining if the narrowness of it, memory tests, all that sort of stuff going on in that. For higher and further education, plus accountability, including replacing Ofsted, who are like sitting above the whole system, making sure that teacher educators are doing their thing, making sure that schools are complying to curriculum sequencing, etc., etc. The whole system has been put together to deliver this ideological agenda. The higher education system section, in our manifesto demands an end to tuition fees, marketisation, and the control by the Office for Students. What Labour should be doing, and yes, I agree with Daniel, there's some starting points there in the policy forum documents, but they don't go anywhere near far enough. We don't need top-down initiatives. Now, if their initiative about excellence for teachers is about giving them that professionalism back, giving them decision-making back, that's great. But we don't need any more numeracy strategies or literacy strategies. We need to liberate teachers from the yoke of Ofsted, from imposed bureaucracy and the dead hand of multi-academy trusts, imposing their corporate way of doing things. The most successful jurisdictions highly respect their teachers and hand over to them and to university education departments responsibility for curriculum development and pedagogy, and allow for extensive professional development programs. And that's exactly what Daniel was saying. It will cost more, much more, but we're not going to get those teachers in unless those opportunities are available. And the SEA also contests the mantra coming from the Labour front bench that school structures are irrelevant, that it doesn't matter if it's a Harris Academy or if it's a grammar school. We contest both of those. We are anti-selection and we are anti-academisation. The Tories clearly think that structures are instrumental in achieving their goals. That's why they've set up the system as it is. We need to think that as well. Having liberated teachers, Labour should liberate schools. They should be liberating them and handing them back to their communities, to parents, to education staff and students, giving them all back a voice in the running of the school, in the running of their schools and the kind of curriculum initiatives they want to see. Again, this is the case in successful jurisdictions, in Canadian provinces, in Finland, and even in the UK, in Scotland and Wales, local communities still retain a voice in their schools. Under the current academised system, where large MATs run schools across the country and are often entirely disconnected from local communities, local democratic oversight cannot take place effectively, if at all. So I would say some priorities for Labour. We on the left like slogans. Well, we've got to come down to them in the end. Scrap SATs, dismantle MATs, abolish Ofsted, and let teachers get on with the job and teach.
Well, James, that's fantastic. 4 really key planks. Let's make sure that the Labour Party both hears that, but thinks about picking up. I think liberating teachers from the yoke of Ofsted would do so much more for recruitment and retention. That, along with a decent pay rise, that we would really be starting in a good place there. Thank you very much for that contribution, James. And now our final 2 speakers come to us from various parts of the Labour Party. So our next speaker is Ian Mearns. He's the chair of the Socialist campaign group. He's been an MP since 2010. He's a member of the Education Select Committee, and therefore, actually can tell us what's being talked about in the corridors of power. And he's a school governor, and he's also chair of the Parliamentary Socialist Education Association. We're very pleased you can join us, Ian. I hope the vote went well. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christine. Well, as you know, since I got into Parliament in 2010, I've spent 13 years in opposition, and just like most of the others, the vote didn't go well because we're in opposition and we don't win votes an awful lot. We'll come second. I'm not really sure about but we come second. Yeah, as you say, Christine, yes, I am a school governor. I've been a school governor continuously now for 40 years. And I'm still chair of a primary school in Gateshead called Kelvin Grove, which has 2 forms of entry, has 52% of its youngsters in receipt of free school meals, 37 languages are spoken, and it's a very happy and calm environment in which those kids can learn. And I'm very, very proud of that, because for an awful lot of those kids, the school becomes an oasis of calm in otherwise chaotic lives. And I think that's vitally important, that we can provide an atmosphere like that. So when it comes to reclaiming our education system, well, having seen basically a Tory government over 13 years dismantle everything, or just about everything, that I'd worked in local government the previous 27 years to try and build, I wouldn't start from here. This is a very, very bad place to start from in terms of reclaiming our education system. We've got a situation where we've just been discussing today about special educational needs in the Education Select Committee. And special educational needs is an absolute mess. And basically the lack of enough professionals in the special educational needs system, professionals like educational psychologists, and then, you know, professionals like speech therapists, occupational therapists, you know, appropriate school nursing staff. All of that means that basically what we are dealing with and managing as a nation is a rationing system for appropriate special educational needs provision for our kids. And along with that, we're also dealing with a burgeoning mental health epidemic amongst our pupil population. We've gone from a situation where 1 in 9, which was always far too high, youngsters who had an identifiable mental health problem in 2019, to that is now apparently 1 in 6, where 1 in 6 youngsters now have an identifiable mental health problem. And of course, the child and adolescent mental health services out there provided by the health service are totally and utterly fractured and inadequate in order to meet that burgeoning need. But also from a perspective of just actually running education and how people understand how education works, looking at a massively fractured administrative landscape. We still have local authorities, and thank goodness that we still did have local authorities during COVID, because they rescued many situations in schools and in our educational settings during that COVID. The very fact that they were still there and still had some responsibility was vitally important. But that responsibility has been diminishing, and they've been defunded by 13 years of a Tory government. Ofsted has been mentioned, but dreadfully badly needs reform. I suppose one claim to fame I can actually say had a hand in was that when the current Chief Inspector, Amanda Spielman, was in front of the committee for a pre-appointment hearing, we recommended back to the DFE that she wasn't fit to appoint, but they still appointed her anyway. Ofqual oversees our exam system. We still have a national and regional schools commissioners. We have various academy trusts. We have diocesan authorities. We still have schools which are maintained directly by the local authorities, and voluntary aided schools, grammar schools. Honestly, we've just got such a daftly diverse system. And I come across as an MP parents all of the time who are finding it increasingly difficult to negotiate the landscape when they hit a problem. They don't know who is responsible and who to talk to. And at the DFE itself, we've had a veritable merry-go-round of ministers and secretaries of state over the last 18 months, but over the last 13 years, you know, they keep changing. I suppose one of the big problems that we have is, though, that Nick Gibb, the schools minister, keeps coming back, and that's been referred to earlier by James. In schools themselves, with massively increasing spending pressures, but not a huge amount of additional money, some additional money, but nowhere near enough. And ministers are telling us that the inherent increase in staffing costs have been budgeted for and are funded. Well, that's not true. Along with that, though, energy and food and other costs are going up, maintenance costs are going up, but energy in particular have been very, very expensive and expensive for schools. And in order to get round the inherent funding crisis and to keep their promise that staffing costs are funded, what the government have actually done, the DFE have done, is altered their guidance to school governors and to school head teachers about how they manage their budgets. So instead of school budgets being 75% for staffing, and now 82% for staffing. So that's fine. You've just got to via money from some other budget heads and move it all into the staffing patch, so that element is funded. But what it actually means in real terms, that your spending on everything else in your budget has to be reduced by about 25%. So, you know, it's just smoke and mirrors by a dreadful government. And we've got, you know, staff striking to protect their living standards, but also to try and protect the whole idea of state education in our schools. And a national recruitment and retention crisis, in particular in subjects like maths, where they're just not recruiting enough potential maths teachers for the future, while the Prime Minister at the same time is suggesting that youngsters should actually do maths in an obligatory way until they're 18. So one thing we'll learn from that is, given the recruitment and retention problems that we're having with maths teachers, is the Prime Minister himself has not done the math in order to actually make that particular conundrum have a solution. So we've also got a post-16 skills catastrophe. The apprenticeship levy led to actually a huge reduction in the number of apprenticeship starts. And does anyone remember when Damien Hines and his predecessors were talking about 3 million apprenticeship starts, and then within 18 months found out that they had very, very quietly just shelved that particular target. But what I also see as a school governor is schools, head teachers and their staff now increasingly picking up the threads where other support services used to intervene and support schools. Children's services, where thresholds for intervention carry on to increase and support that continues to decrease. We've seen a youth service which has been eradicated in many places, and early years provision underfunded and not, frankly, good enough for too many if they can find a place. Support services that are a patchwork quilt with varying levels of inadequacy in many, many places. From my perspective, it's all very well doing that analysis, and there's so much more that I could say, but it won't be good enough for us just to say this is how bad things have become. We've actually got to have some tangible solutions. All of that is as bad as it is. It's good to have a proper understanding of the depth and the breadth of the problems the Labour government will inherit, but that has to be followed with firm commitments, a positive policy narrative that is backed with resources to begin to create an education system that is free, comprehensive, accountable, democratic, and importantly, ambitious for our children, so they can thrive in a situation where they should be able to sort of map out their lives because of the quality of the education that is being delivered to them. Education should not be about producing the next generation of units for the labour market, but it should be about producing the next generation of well-educated, well-rounded human beings. I don't really know what else I can say. I entirely endorse, and the campaign group has entirely endorsed the Socialist Education Association's manifesto. It's a great building block. It's going to take some tough arguing. I'm not absolutely confident that our front bench will come up with the resourcing that is going to be required. But what we do need to do is never give up, keep plugging away and putting pressure on those potentially in places of power, so that we can actually start to turn this whole juggernaut around.
Ian, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. You know, however grim things are, and they certainly are grim, it is great that you're proud of the school of which you're a governor, because you know what we all know is that governors and education staff and certainly the vast majority of parents and kids do work together to make it work, even against the odds. So imagine how much better it would be if we actually had a properly functioning and fully funded education system. So thanks very much for all of that, Ian. Now we come to our final speaker, and our final speaker is Nabeela Mowlana, who is a councillor in Sheffield. But from our point of view, the interesting thing is that she's chair of Young Labour. I read a speech that she'd given, I think maybe when she was standing as chair of Young Labour, but anyway, whenever. And she concluded with the wonderful phrase, "We fight for bread, but we fight for roses too." So inspire us, Nabeela, with all the things for which we need to fight, some of which are absolutely roses. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you for that very kind introduction. Hi everyone, it's great to be here with you today, especially following this great lineup of speakers. As Christine mentioned, I have the privilege of being the chair of Young Labour, but I'm also a postgraduate student, an education student in particular, at UCL. Now, the student movement has long been the birthplace of bold policies. It has forced us to reckon with the issues of our time and tackle them with real solutions. Students demanded for universal healthcare before the creation of the NHS. They built bridges with their counterparts across Ireland, providing a blueprint for the Good Friday Agreement that would follow 26 years later. And they were the first to pass policy in support of LGBT rights back in 1973. So from vocally opposing the Iraq War to organising economic boycotts and campaigning against apartheid in South Africa, students haven't shied away from standing up for what they believe in. And on tuition fees, time and time again, students have made it clear they believe in free education. Now, it should come as no surprise that when the Labour Party committed itself to abolishing tuition fees in 2017, thousands of students flocked to the Labour Party, and some voted Labour for the first time. Students up and down the country door-knocked, phoned banks and delivered leaflets. And after being let down by the coalition government and the horror of Millbank, it was refreshing to know that a party that could be the next government would be on our side. Now, tuition fees were supposedly introduced to level the playing field. But as our last two manifestos acknowledged, the experiment has failed. Students are no longer seen as learners, they are now consumers to be exploited for increasing profits. A marketised education system affects our quality of teaching. As we heard from Janet earlier, it also affects the treatment of our staff in our institutions and the unbearable costs of rent for poor quality housing. And I think we must acknowledge that free education is about much more than just getting rid of tuition fees. It's about a fundamental rethink of the way we research, the way we teach, and the way we utilise education. Years after the coalition government tripled tuition fees, the COVID pandemic further politicised students. So many found themselves laid off from their precarious jobs without being eligible for furlough. They were paying rent for rooms they couldn't live in. And some of them were locked in their rooms after being forced back onto campus. Weeks later, A-level students had their results botched by the incompetence of this Tory government, with GCSE students and their results facing the same fate just a week later. Now, all these students will be voters at the next general election. So it's clear that we need to commit to meaningful education reform. And now Labour clubs across our political spectrum and a majority of the National Committee of Labour Students have invited the Labour leadership to clarify their position on tuition fees. Because it's so important that we don't alienate the next generation of would-be Labour voters. My generation is the first in 100 years to be worse off than our parents, with the poorest graduates leaving university with an average £57,000 of debt. My own debt is a little over £73,000. And as this Tory government stands at the edge of collapse, and many students find themselves disillusioned with the state of affairs in Parliament, this is Labour's opportunity to place ourselves firmly as the party with the alternative. We need to show that as a party, we're willing to take the level of action that truly speaks to the scale of issues in our education system. Not just in universities, but in schools, colleges, and alternative education providers. We can offer a vision of education that expands our understanding of the world and our capacity to change it. And I think ultimately we can and must respond to despair with socialist solutions, be the vehicle for hope, and ultimately secure the confidence of a generation. I'd like to end with sending our solidarity to all those who have been on strike or will be going out on strike with the NEU or UCU. Across the country, young Labour members have been out on picket lines, and for as long as you're on strike, we'll be on those pickets with you.
Thank you very much, Nabeela. That's exactly what we want to hear from people representing the Labour Party, that where people have to take strike action, Labour politicians have to be on the picket line. And thank you very much for talking about socialist solutions. Now, we've got a number of questions. They're all of these questions are specific to one particular panel member, and then we've got a wrap-up question at the end. So I'm gonna read out what your question is, and then I'm gonna come to you. I'm gonna read them all out, and then I'm gonna come to you to answer it, so you get a bit of thinking time. So, Daniel, this is a question to you from Julie. How do we get any sense of democratic accountability into multi-academy trusts? And she says, where do local authorities fit into any new system that we're imagining from Labour? Okay. For Janet, Christine from Essex says, how do we get adult education doing what it should do and what it used to do? And Rupert adds in shaping new Labour policy, would you look to reverse the axing of BTECs, and how should Labour shape the post-16 curriculum? These are all, by the way, very long questions with potentially very long answers. For James, Dave says, what do people, so I guess he means the people you talk to, James, think about the increasing commodification of education and the loss of academic tenure sweeping towards us across the Atlantic? For Ian, Esther from Waltham Forest talks about the SEND crisis in East London. She says there's a £2 billion special educational needs funding shortfall annually in England and Wales. This is resulting in some people who are falling out of the system, as I think you already said, Ian, and so you clearly know. How do we get this issue up the political agenda and stop people treating it as a niche concern? And finally, Nabeela, for you, George says, as a post-2012 intake student, I definitely feel the mountain of debt. I can't believe you've got £73,000 worth of debt, Nabeela. That's horrendous. One of the justifications and explanations was it allowed mass expansion of education under New Labour. So his question is, how can we abolish tuition fees without having to reduce access to higher education? There you are. That's the not quite the holy grail. There are places that do it. Anyway, so I'm going to come back to you in the order that you spoke in the first place, and then I'm going to reverse the order for the last question. Okay, so Daniel, democratic accountability in multi-academy trusts, and what should local authorities do in a new system?
That's a very good question. I mean, ultimately, to have democratic accountability in terms of maths, we need a change in legislation around that fundamentally. I mean, the whole reason for academisation, it was brought through to provide that local choice and accountability in that sense, and it's completely flawed. In fact, what we're seeing now is quite shocking in areas where, you know, we're seeing falling pupil rolls, like in London. We are now seeing those buildings and properties that were once under control of a local authority, you know, being turned into flats and sold off for huge profits, which is issue. I mean, I suppose what we absolutely need to do is strengthen campaign groups like Anti-Academies Alliance and build that grassroots and certainly organise parents around accountability to multi-academy trusts as well. I mean, the LA system, I mean, fundamentally, what we would like to see is a renationalisation of education. that is at the core of it. You know, whether that will happen anytime soon is another question, but the LA system, you know, really needs to be brought back to provide those things that Ian was talking about in his speech. You know, everything that was provided through COVID, local authorities were absolutely vital for, but there's been so many services that have been stripped back in terms of what LA's provide and in terms of education, and we need to see those very much come back, whether it's, you know, special needs support, support around Gypsy, Roma, traveller education, and so on. But fundamentally, we need a legislation change, and that'll only come through bottom up, through a bottom up process.
Thanks, Daniel. I just add that actually, even the people who were originally in favour of multi-academy trusts, many of them feel that this notion that you can have a trust that runs from Liverpool to Plymouth is just nonsensical. Yeah. So, you know, the very least thing that we could be asking the Labour Party to do is break up multi-academy trusts so they have some geographical coherence and can actually relate to a local authority. So, yeah, there are things that can be done, but it's a big task. Okay, so Janet, let's think about how we can get adult education back, but also about what might the post-16 curriculum or up to 16 curriculum look like with what should Labour be doing about that?
Yeah, again, really good questions. I mean, on adult education, you know, kind of doing what it should do. I mean, James covered it really well. You know, I'm a huge proponent of learning for learning's sake. You know, the joy of learning, being able to learn a new skill, you know, being able to go to an adult community centre. You know, my other half actually at the minute is doing a sewing course, you know, at Bury Community College. You know, he doesn't want to go into a job in sewing, but, you know, he wants to learn a new skill. Like, so, and we like that he's subverting gender stereotypes, of course, as well. You know, but it is so important, adult education. You know, I used to teach GCSE English to access students, so adults who haven't had a kind of standard route through education for lots of different reasons. You know, there were two women who stand out from that class who were both nurses in Sierra Leone, you know, and they'd had a hugely traumatic history, and then they wanted to go to university in the UK and access through further education, through adult education was their route into that, you know. So we can't really underestimate the transformative power of adult education and how important it is for communities. Of course, it needs proper funding. That is ultimately what it needs. You know, our members who work in adult education are amongst the lowest paid teachers in the whole of the education sector. Not to mention prison education, which of course, Christine, you've been an absolutely brilliant proponent for. And the other huge issue in adult education is casualisation. You know, there's just so many teachers on precarious contracts having to travel from site to site, sometimes really long distances, you know, keeping all of their resources in the boot of their car, not having a proper desk, you know, not having a laptop, you know, some of the kind of fundamental things that they need to be able to do their job. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, we need the cuts to level 3 provision to be reversed or not to go through in the first place. There are also huge issues with devolved funding that we're facing in trade union studies, you know, now that the Union Learning Fund has gone, which is a real massive loss in terms of basic skills for adults. And, you know, we face really unnecessary bureaucratic barriers in terms of postcodes and that kind of thing. So there are a number of really kind of straightforward things that could be fixed that would at least increase that access to provision. And, you know, and on BTECs and the kind of choice and where that will go, obviously, I did mention that in my speech. I just think choice is just so vital for students. You know, everyone has got a different set of skill sets. The Tories think that working class kids shouldn't do academic subjects. You know, they've got no interest in the working class studying A-levels, for example. You know, I did A-levels at an FE college against the odds. And then, you know, went on to a Russell Group University. You don't have to be pigeonholed as a working class student, you know, and I think there's a lot of that goes on. The point is, it's horses for courses, you know, people want to do different things, they've got different skill sets, they should have the choice, you know, and the idea that BTEC should be removed from the curriculum is a real attack on working class education, in my view.
Janet, thanks very much. I mean, I think a commitment to reverse any BTECs that do get defunded should be a big commitment, really, for the Labour Party, because after all, you know, you can access university by going through the BTEC route as well. So it's not as though it's even, you know, they're great courses on their own, but there also can be a stepping stone to something else. Okay, James, so what do people think about commodification? And what about the loss of academic tenure, by which I guess Dave means both in higher education and further education. But frankly, you know, when I started teaching in 1973, people got permanent contracts. Now they don't, you know, so there are big issues here. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing about, I mean, this is a quote from Michael Rosen, actually, but I might well have heard it. It said, first they said they needed data about the children to find out what they're learning. Then they said they needed data about the children to make sure they're learning. Then the children only learned what could be turned into data. And then the children became data. So we've got we have got a kind of neoliberal system in which children are reduced and educational success is reduced to a commodity, and children are reduced to commodities through, and in fact, that teacher that quote at the beginning was, and another teacher I spoke to said exactly that the child becomes a number that you've either got to move in one direction or another to get your to meet your targets, or to get your to make sure your school maintains its position in the performance tables. So we're seeing education commodified across the system, and we're seeing inbuilt failure, which I think, as James was saying, is deliberate. I mean, there is a rationing of grades so that only certain numbers of kids pass GCSEs, for example. There's always about 37, 38% who don't get the top grades. Nearly all of them are disadvantaged. When you, in the inverted commas, when you get to A level, you've got a sense of the most disadvantaged kids being not just A level, but FE in BTEC and those courses. But A level grades equivalent, they're 4 grades behind the non-disadvantaged. So that's how our system is leveling up. It's not, it's leveling down effectively. Moving on to to casualisation and tenure. It's a terrible kind of wedge, isn't it? It starts with a kind of thin end of using temporary staff to cover for absences, and using agencies to cut, which are a total rip-off, by the way. I mean, I think Labour could probably fund the education system with the profits that recruitment agencies make. It starts with that thin end of the wedge, and then it leads to 1-year temporary contracts, followed by particularly, I know, and I don't know as much about FE and HE as some colleagues the SAA do, but there it's become clear that casualisation has become a major part of university and FE college life now, and it needs to be reversed. And I think it's the nature partly of the marketisation and of the funding regimes, and of colleges and universities never being sure about, you know, how many people are going to come through the door and how much money they're going to have. So they're always backing the the worst case scenario. So putting people on temporary contracts. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is we need to change funding mechanisms away from the insistence that everything has to be done on numbers. If and this applies to schools as well. Numbers may be a small part of it, because obviously if you suddenly have a certain increase, you need increases in funding. But schools should be funded per se. They shouldn't be funded down to the last child. What that creates is the lack of tenure and the kind of temporary contract hell that some people have to go through. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much for all of that, James. And now I'm coming to you, Ian. So Esther had all the background on special educational needs funding, but essentially her question is, how do we get this issue up the political agenda and for people to stop treating it as a niche concern? You know, special educational needs funding and disability funding is it's for everybody. It's for schools to make sure that they can respond to the needs that any children present with. So what should we do about it?
Well, I think you're entirely right, and I think it's an important question. I think it is moving up the agenda, but possibly not rapidly enough, or you know. But I think special educational needs funding has been moving up the agenda for a while. And I think Esther in her question said that the SEND block is underfunded by about 2 billion. I think Esther's about 2 billion short of that. Actually, I think it's about 4 billion right. in real terms. We've got increasing numbers of youngsters now. It's about 4% across the whole of the country who've now got an education, health and care plan, what we used to call a statement of special educational needs. And about another 15 or 16% of youngsters who are non-statemented but have special educational needs of one way, shape or form. So, you know, that's an awful lot of parents out there who are being, and their children let down because of the inadequacies of the system currently. And, you know, there's a huge amount of lobbying going on by, you know, particular specialist groups in the voluntary sector to deal with youngsters with special educational needs, you know, youngsters with autism or hearing or visual disabilities. You know, there's just a plethora of lobbying groups out there. So I think it can move up up the agenda, but it's quite clear that it's massively under-resourced. And I'm afraid to say the lack of resourcing, and I'll reiterate what I said before, is just used as a rationing system so that an awful lot of youngsters with special educational needs are trying to be coped with in the mainstream system currently, waiting an assessment which for many of them might never come. It is frankly dreadful. But I really do think that we kind of need a root and branch reform of provision for special educational needs. I mean, we had Claire Coutinho, the minister, in front of the committee this morning, and she was talking about, oh, well, we're building 90 schools. When I said, well, have you done a scoping exercise to make sure that they're for the right specialisms and being put in the right place? And they just hadn't done it. They just hadn't done that scoping exercise. And let's not forget, by the way, there are 150 top tier local authority areas. So they're building 90 special schools in 150 top tier local authorities. And we don't have a map of what those specialist schools are meant to be coping with in terms of the youngsters. It's frankly a mess. And I wouldn't mind betting that the distribution of those new 90 schools has probably been done on the basis of pork barrel politics by the Tories, because that's what they've done with everything else. Can I also just make a quick comment on what James was talking about in terms of academies and marketisation? Let's never forget, by the way, that academies were introduced to the English system by the Labour government until 2010. You know, it was a small number, and it was about the reason that they introduced it was about turning around failing schools. But never forget, by the way, that they were based on the charter school model in the United States of America. And of course, the most successful state in America for educational outcomes for its children is Massachusetts. And Massachusetts has got an upper limit on the number of charter schools that it will allow in its own state system, no more than 8%. And yet the government here have gone for an entirely wall-to-wall academy program. And of course, the states in America, like Louisiana, which did go for a wall-to-wall charter school program, are still at the bottom of the educational leagues.
Very good international comment there. Thank you very much, Ian. That's very good to finish on that. Okay, so we come to your question, Nabeela. Okay, so you've just got to tell us now, if we abolish tuition fees, how can we do that without reducing access to higher education to, George says maybe down to 10% or the select few. But while you're thinking of your answer to that, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to come to you first for this second round and final question, which gives you the opportunity, please, to say what one specific promise you would like to see in the Labour Party manifesto. So answer George's question, make a couple of remarks if you want to, but give us one specific idea. And then I'm going to go back through the speakers and ask you to tell us what the one specific promise is. Over to you, Nabeela.
Lovely, thank you, Christine, and thank you for the question, George. So I think, in short, I absolutely think we can abolish tuition fees without reducing access, and it's almost two ways to look at this. The first is having tuition fees hasn't necessarily leveled our access to higher education or our outcomes from it. We know students of colour, disabled students, working class students, they do have a much harder time getting into university. And when they finally manage to get in, sort out their massive housing deposit and get themselves onto campus, they then face a whole host of other access issues once they're there. And, we could probably have a much longer session on the degree awarding gap alone. But on the matter of investing in education, I think investing in education is a matter of priorities, right? And it's only when we ask for things like better wages or housing, healthcare, education, that's when we're told there's no money or not enough money. I think it's really important that we actually start to push back against this narrative. For instance, we're currently living through a climate crisis. And as a country, if we want to properly respond to this crisis, if we want to support innovation, boost the economy, create a better rounded society, and all the other things we want to do as a Labour government, then I think funding education is absolutely fundamental to this. So for my one promise in the Labour manifesto, you really put me on the spot there, Christine. I have a long wish list. But I think just committing to whole-scale reform of our education system and completely demarketising it right across the sector would be my big wish.
Demarketisation, great. Okay, thanks very much, Nabeela. I'm coming back to you, Ian, now. One big wish for something that you would like Labour to absolutely promise in their election manifesto, in our election manifesto.
Right. Well, the one I would go for is a completely redrafting of the curriculum so that the curriculum would be appropriate to the needs of all young people, not just the ones who are destined to go to university. So, far too many youngsters in our schools are turned off because they're not academic in the way in which we would normally understand that, and therefore a properly comprehensive and inclusive curriculum which helps every young person achieve their own individual goals and fulfill their own potential.
Great, yeah, curriculum review is one of my favourites too. Okay, I'm going to come to you now, James.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to go for something that probably won't be in it because I think there will be, hopefully I think there have already been little signals that the curriculum might be up for revision, which is great. Now, I'm going to go for democratic accountability of schools and bringing schools back under local democratic control. I don't just want to go back to local authority control. I think we've got to have a much wider, far more democratic approach than that. We're not just going to go backwards. We need parents' forums, teachers' forums. We need pupils and learners' forums. We need we're not just giving schools back to local communities. We're giving local communities a voice in the education of their children. And I think that is crucial. And I think it's a vote winner, actually. But I doubt it'll be in there.
Great, though. Good idea, though, James. Thank you very much. Okay, Janet, your one big wish for a promise in the Labour Party manifesto.
Yeah, it's tough, this, isn't it? It's like daddy or chips. I would say that, a commitment to proper funding across education, but, you know, if I'm talking from my members' point of view, you know, across the FE sectors, so FE, person and adult education, you know, a commitment to proper funding, because ultimately those sectors are not going to survive without it. So that would be a really good starting point.
That's great, Janet, thank you. And right, Daniel, for you to round up, one big wish for a promise from the Labour Party.
Oh, there's so many things that need changing in education, Christine. I wish Labour, any political party, particularly Labour, as they're likely to be the next government, would commit to a Finnish-style system of education for our children, where they start education much later in life. You know, academic learning doesn't start until 7. Early years education subsidised and it's play-based. There's no privatisation. There's no marketisation. There's no league tables. It's a fully comprehensive system with class sizes on average of 19. Teachers are well paid, they are respected, they have professional control and autonomy over what they teach and how they teach. So I would like to see a radical education act that brought around a system like that. But if not, some real work done on the recruitment and retention crisis that is unraveling in education. It can't go on. We're on the brink of the whole system grinding to a halt. So we need to have a real wage rise, manageable workloads, and some more professional control.
That's great, Daniel. So either we want to turn ourselves into Finland, or at the very least, we want a fully funded, proper education service. And as James said, with democratic accountability and all of the other really important ideas that came up in that last round of questions. That's it, comrades. Thank you very much for your participation. May I just say, on behalf of everyone who tuned in, thank you very much to our speakers. And can I say, on behalf of our speakers, thank you very much for all of you for watching and listening and participating, because if you hadn't been there, we'd have been talking to ourselves, which is not really a good idea. So let's make sure that we take away from this meeting that education with the right policies is a really big vote winner for the Labour Party. So let's make sure that we're pressing in all levels and all sections of the Labour Party for the kind of policies that we've been talking about this evening, so that we really can reclaim our education system. Thanks very much, comrades. Solidarity.